November 14, 1944. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside a makeshift prisoner of war facility in rural Pennsylvania, sending up clouds of dust that caught the pale afternoon light. Inside the covered bed, 43 German women sat in silence, their backs rigid despite the exhaustion that had settled into their bones during the 3-day journey from the East Coast Processing Center. They wore the remnants of their gray auxiliary uniforms, now dirt-stained and threadbare, hanging loose on frames that had grown thin over months of wartime deprivation. Adelheid Keller, whom everyone had once called Heidi, kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the canvas covering. At 24 years old, she had served as a communications specialist for the Wehrmacht, operating radio equipment in occupied France until Allied forces had overrun their position in late September. Now she sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced to hide their trembling. She had not eaten a full meal in over 18 months. None of them had, but they would never speak of the hunger that gnawed at them constantly, the emptiness that had become as familiar as breathing. Beside her, Matilda Bauer shifted slightly, her nurse's training evident in the way she cataloged the physical condition of the women around her without appearing to look directly at anyone. Tilda had turned 31 just before their capture, though the hollows beneath her cheekbones made her appear older. She noticed how Hedwig Lehmann's hands shook, how Crystal Wagner's collarbone protruded sharply above her collar, how Edith Richter's eyes had taken on the glassy look of someone whose body was consuming itself for fuel. The truck's tailgate dropped open with a metallic clang, and American soldiers gestured for them to disembark. The women rose slowly, joints stiff from the long journey, and stepped down into the late autumn air. Captain Robert Morrison stood waiting, a clipboard in his hands and an expression that the women could not quite read. Not hatred, as they had expected, not cruelty, something closer to careful neutrality, perhaps even a hint of concern. The facility before them was modest, a collection of wooden barracks surrounding a central administrative building, all enclosed by wire fencing. It was nothing like the massive prisoner of war camps they had heard existed in Texas and other states, places that held thousands of captured German soldiers. This smaller compound had been hastily adapted to house women prisoners, a category the American military had not anticipated needing to accommodate in such numbers. Captain Morrison began speaking, his words translated by a young corporal who stumbled over the German phrases. They would be assigned to barracks. They would follow camp regulations. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, standard procedures, standard warnings, the administrative machinery of captivity grinding, forward with its usual efficiency. But Heidi barely heard the words. Her attention had been captured by something else entirely, a smell drifting from what appeared to be the camp kitchen, rich, savory, completely foreign to her recent experience. Her stomach contracted painfully, and she pressed one hand against her abdomen, willing herself not to show weakness. Around her, other women had caught the scent as well. Their carefully maintained composure wavered for just a moment before they reasserted control, standing straighter, lifting their chins, refusing to acknowledge the hunger that defined them. The dining hall was nothing like what they had expected. Long wooden tables with benches, plain but sturdy, filled the space beneath exposed rafters. Evening light slanted through western windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The 43 women filed in silently, their military training evident in their orderly formation despite months of chaos and defeat. They had been given 30 minutes to wash and settle into their assigned barracks before being called for the evening meal. Heidi found herself standing near the serving line, watching with carefully concealed amazement as American kitchen staff began placing food on metal trays. The portions seemed impossibly large, a thick slice of meatloaf, its surface glazed and glistening, mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting into a golden pool at the center. Green beans, actual green beans, not the gray, limp vegetables of wartime rationing. A piece of bread white and soft, nothing like the sawdust-filled ersatz bread she had choked down for years. And incredibly, unbelievably, a small square of chocolate cake. Tilda stood behind Heidi in line, her medical mind automatically calculating nutritional value, protein content, the shock such rich food might deliver to systems accustomed to near starvation. She wanted to warn the others to eat slowly, to be careful, but the words died in her throat. Who was she to deny them this? Who was she to insert caution into what might be their first real meal in longer than any of them cared to remember? The women carried their trays to the tables and sat in silence. No one touched their food. Years of military discipline and German propriety held them motionless, waiting for permission, waiting for orders, waiting for the trap to reveal itself. Surely this was some kind of test. Surely the Americans would not simply give them food like this without expecting something in return. Corporal David Chen, a young Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, noticed their hesitation. He approached the nearest table where Hedwig Lehman sat staring at her tray as if it might vanish if she blinked. In careful, slow English that he hoped might penetrate the language barrier, he said simply, "Please, eat. It is yours." Hetty looked up at him, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. Then slowly she picked up her fork. Her hand shook as she cut a small piece of meatloaf and raised it to her lips. The moment the food touched her tongue, something inside her shattered. Tears began streaming down her face, silent at first, then accompanied by quiet sobs that shook her thin shoulders. The breakdown was contagious. Crystal Wagner was next, then Edith Richter, then women whose names Heidi did not yet know. They wept while they ate, unable to stop either the tears or the desperate consumption of food their bodies craved. Some tried to maintain dignity, eating with mechanical precision, while tears dripped onto their trays. Others abandoned pretense entirely, holding bread to their faces and breathing in the scent before devouring it. Heidi felt her own throat tighten, felt the hot pressure building behind her eyes. She had promised herself she would not cry. She had maintained her composure through capture, through interrogation, through the humiliation of defeat. But this simple act of being fed, of being given sustenance without cruelty or condition, undid something fundamental inside her. She set down her fork and allowed herself to weep. The morning after that first overwhelming meal, Heidi woke before dawn with her stomach cramping. Her body, unaccustomed to rich food, protested the sudden abundance. She lay on her narrow bunk listening to similar sounds of discomfort from other women in the barracks, none of them complaining, all of them willing to endure the pain because it meant they had actually eaten real food. As gray light filtered through the windows, Heidi's mind drifted back to Hamburg in 1943, to the small apartment she had shared with her mother and younger sister. She remembered her mother standing at the stove, trying to make something edible from their weekly rations, a handful of withered carrots, their tops already cut away for soup, potatoes so small and misshapen that peeling them meant losing half the vegetable, cabbage that had frozen and thawed too many times, turning slimy and brown at the edges. Green had been a color that disappeared from German tables as the war dragged on. The vibrant snap of fresh beans, the crisp brightness of lettuce, the sweet crunch of peas. These became memories, then fantasies, then forgotten dreams. What they called vegetables were pale shadows, gray-green things boiled into submission, stretched with water to make them seem like more than they were. Tilda had her own memories of wartime food, perhaps even more painful because her medical training had taught her exactly what malnutrition was doing to the population. She had watched children in her hospital ward develop rickets from lack of proper nutrients, had seen pregnant women unable to produce milk because their own bodies were starving. The vegetables that arrived at the hospital kitchen were often rotten, but they used them anyway, cutting away the worst parts and pretending what remained had any nutritional value. In the mess hall that morning, the German women faced American breakfast with equal parts wonder and trepidation. Scrambled eggs. Actual eggs, not the powder substitute they had grown accustomed to. Bacon with visible fat, something that would have been hoarded like gold in Germany. Toast with butter and jam. And on the side of each plate, sliced tomatoes, their red flesh bright and firm and impossibly fresh for November. Crystal Wagner stared at the tomato slices as if they were precious jewels. She had grown up on a farm in Bavaria, had spent her childhood summers helping her father tend vegetable gardens that produced abundantly. But that was before the war, before every scrap of arable land was commanded for grain production, before fertilizer became impossible to obtain, before her father and brothers were sent to the Eastern Front and never returned. She picked up a tomato slice with her fingers, unable to trust a fork with something so valuable. The flesh was cool and slightly acidic on her tongue, nothing like the mealy, tasteless things that had occasionally appeared in wartime Germany, grown in depleted soil by exhausted farmers. This tomato tasted the way she remembered tomatoes should taste, the way food was supposed to nourish not just the body, but something deeper, something she had almost forgotten existed. Edith Richter watched Crystal's reverent consumption of the tomato and felt something crack inside her own, carefully maintained composure. She had told herself that Germany's sacrifices were necessary, that deprivation was the price of defending the fatherland. But looking at this simple American breakfast, she began to question what kind of nation allowed its people to starve, while convincing them it was patriotic to do so. Thanksgiving arrived with unexpected gentleness. The German women had been at the facility for 2 weeks, and the initial shock of adequate food had begun to settle into something approaching normalcy. Their bodies were slowly adjusting, the constant cramping subsiding as their systems remembered how to process proper nutrition. Some color had returned to faces that had been gray with deprivation. Tilda noticed that Hetty no longer trembled when she stood, that Crystal's eyes had lost some of their glassy desperation. Captain Morrison had wrestled with how to handle the holiday. These were enemy prisoners, technically, though watching them weep over their first real meals had made that designation feel increasingly hollow. He decided on a modest celebration, nothing elaborate, but something that acknowledged the American tradition of gratitude and shared abundance. The kitchen staff prepared a traditional feast, turkey, though smaller birds than what American families enjoyed. Stuffing, made with actual bread rather than filler, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes with brown sugar, and several dishes the German women had never encountered. Among them was a casserole that Private Morrison's grandmother had taught him to make before he shipped out. Green bean. Casserole with cream of mushroom soup and crispy fried onions on top. When the women filed into the dining hall that Thursday afternoon, they stopped short at the sight before them. The tables had been arranged differently, set with real plates instead of metal trays, and the food was presented family-style in large serving dishes. It looked less like a prison feeding and more like the holiday gathering some of them dimly remembered from before the war consumed everything. Heidi found herself seated across from Corporal Chen, who had been assigned to help serve and explain the various dishes. He pointed to each one, offering simple English names that meant nothing to most of the women. But when he reached the green bean casserole, he paused and smiled. "My favorite," he said, then demonstrated by spooning a generous portion onto his own plate. The women watched, then tentatively began serving themselves. Heidi took a small amount of the green bean casserole, still cautious about rich foods, still half convinced this abundance might be temporary. She studied it carefully, green beans in a creamy sauce, topped with something golden and crispy. Steam rose from the dish, carrying a smell that was savory and comforting in a way she could not quite name. Tilda was the first to taste it. Her fork cut through the crispy onion topping, gathered green beans coated in mushroom cream, and lifted to her mouth. Her eyes closed as she chewed slowly, methodically, as if trying to understand each component. The beans were tender, but still had structure, nothing like the gray, overcooked vegetables of wartime Germany. The sauce was rich with cream and butter, luxurious in a way that seemed almost sinful. The fried onions added texture and a savory depth that made the whole dish feel complete. When she opened her eyes, tears were sliding down her cheeks again, but these were different from the desperate weeping of that first meal. These tears carried something else, recognition of what mercy could taste like, of what it meant when enemies chose to feed you not just adequately, but well. Around the table, other women were discovering the same truth, each bite teaching them that kindness could be as simple as vegetables made rich with cream. December brought snow to Pennsylvania, transforming the prison camp into something almost picturesque. The women had settled into routines, work assignments, English lessons with Corporal Chen, and increasingly frequent interactions with American staff that felt less like guard-prisoner relationships and more like cautious friendships. But it was in the kitchen where the most unexpected transformation began. Staff Sergeant Marie Kowalski ran the camp kitchen with efficient precision. A second-generation Polish immigrant from Pittsburgh, she had initially resented the assignment of feeding German prisoners. Her own relatives in Poland had suffered under Nazi occupation. But watching these skeletal women weep over simple meals had softened something in her practical heart. They were not the Wehrmacht soldiers who had devastated her ancestral homeland. They were just hungry women who had been caught in something larger than themselves. One morning in mid-December, she made an unprecedented decision. She needed extra help preparing meals for the growing camp population, and the German women were already assigned to kitchen duties for dishwashing and cleaning. Why not teach them to actually cook? The idea was unconventional, perhaps even controversial, but Sergeant Kowalski had never been one to follow unnecessary rules. She approached Heidi first, having noticed the young woman's careful attention during meals, the way she seemed to study each dish as if trying to decode its secrets. Through Corporal Chen's translation, she made her proposal. Would Heidi like to learn to prepare American food, not just serve it, but actually make it? Heidi's response was immediate and enthusiastic, her careful composure cracking to reveal genuine excitement. Within days, Tilda, Hetty, and Crystal had joined what became informal cooking lessons. Sergeant Kowalski started with simple dishes, the same green bean casserole that had moved them so deeply at Thanksgiving. She laid out the ingredients with the patience of a teacher, not a guard. Fresh green beans, though she explained that many Americans used canned ones for convenience. Cream of mushroom soup, which she showed them how to make from scratch when supplies allowed. The crispy fried onions that provided that essential texture. She demonstrated blanching the beans, mixing the sauce, layering everything in the baking dish with care. But the real education was not in the recipe itself, it was in the philosophy behind it. American cooking, Sergeant Kowalski explained through Chen's translation, was about abundance and sharing. It was about making dishes that could feed many people, that could stretch to accommodate unexpected guests, that celebrated having enough rather than constantly managing scarcity. Tilda's hands shook the first time she stirred cream into the mushroom base, not from weakness now, but from the strangeness of working with such rich ingredients without measuring every drop. In Germany, even before the worst shortages, her mother had taught her to cook with precision, born of necessity. Every gram of butter accounted for, every milliliter of milk carefully rationed. This American approach felt almost reckless in its generosity. Crystal discovered she had an intuitive talent for seasoning, tasting, and adjusting with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. Hetty learned to prepare the fried onion topping, achieving perfect golden crispness that made Sergeant Kowalski nod with approval. The kitchen became a place where language barriers dissolved into the universal communication of cooking, where former enemies stood side by side, sharing techniques and tastes, building something together instead of tearing things apart. Spring came to Pennsylvania with hesitant warmth, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and revealing earth that had been frozen since before the German women arrived. March turned to April, and with it came an announcement that none of the prisoners had expected. Captain Morrison stood before them in the common area and explained, through Corporal Chen's translation, that they would be permitted to plant a victory garden. The irony was not lost on anyone. Victory gardens were an American wartime tradition meant to supplement rations and support the war effort. Now German prisoners of war would be allowed to participate in this uniquely American practice, growing vegetables on enemy soil while their own homeland faced starvation and defeat. Crystal had been the first to volunteer, her farming background making her the obvious choice to lead the effort. When the tools were distributed, actual shovels, rakes, and hoes, not the makeshift implements she had expected, she stood holding them with something approaching reverence. In Germany, such tools had been confiscated, melted down for the war machine. Here, the Americans were handing them to prisoners without apparent concern. The designated plot was modest, perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet, situated behind the mess hall, where it would receive full sun. The soil was rich, dark Pennsylvania earth that crumbled properly when Crystal dug her fingers into it, not the exhausted, depleted soil of wartime Germany that refused to nurture anything, no matter how desperately farmers tried. Heidi joined her that first morning, along with Tilda, Hetty, and Edith. They had no seeds yet. Those would come from Sergeant Kowalski, who had connections with local farming communities. But they could prepare the ground, turn the soil, remove rocks and roots, create neat rows that waited for planting. The physical labor felt different than the work assignments they had been given before. This was not punishment or mere occupation. This was creation. Heidi felt muscles she had forgotten she possessed beginning to ache pleasantly as she worked the rake across prepared soil. Sweat gathered at her temples despite the cool morning air, and she welcomed it. Tilda found herself remembering her grandmother's kitchen garden in Bavaria, the small plot behind the house where herbs and vegetables grew in cheerful abundance. She had been perhaps 7 years old, following her grandmother between the rows, learning the names of plants and how to tend them. That memory had been buried under years of war and deprivation, but now it surfaced with unexpected clarity. When Sergeant Kowalski arrived with seed packets 2 days later, the women gathered around her like children at Christmas. Green beans, naturally, but also tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, radishes, and summer squash. She explained planting depths and spacing, but Crystal already knew, her hands remembering what her mind had tried to forget. The first seeds went into the ground on April 18, 1945. The women patted soil over them gently, watered them with care, and for the first time since their capture, they felt something that resembled hope. They were not just consuming abundance anymore. They were being trusted to create it. Late April brought the first tender shoots of green beans pushing through the soil, and with them came news that would shatter whatever remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. The garden had become a daily ritual, a place of quiet hope where Crystal checked each plant's progress with maternal attention. But on April 29th, Heidi arrived at the garden plot carrying an American newspaper, her face ashen. The other women looked up from their weeding to see her standing motionless at the garden's edge. Tilda rose first, recognizing the expression of someone in shock. She crossed the rows carefully, avoiding the young plants, and took the newspaper from Heidi's trembling hands. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable, skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors with hollow eyes staring at cameras, American soldiers standing amid evidence of systematic murder. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that meant nothing to them, camps they had never heard of, horrors committed in the same country they had proudly served. The accompanying articles described death factories, gas chambers, mountains of shoes and glasses, and human hair. The scope of the atrocity was incomprehensible, the deliberate industrialization of murder beyond anything their minds could accept. Crystal read over Tilda's shoulder, her German more fluent than the halting English most of them had acquired. As the meaning became clear, she sank to her knees in the freshly turned soil, dirt staining her work pants. The green bean plants she had so carefully tended swayed slightly in the breeze, innocent and growing, while she grappled with the knowledge that her country had been growing death. Hetty began to weep, not the tears of relief they had shed over meals, but wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deeper than hunger or homesickness. Edith stood rigid, her face frozen in denial, shaking her head slowly, as if she could refuse the truth by force of will alone. They had been sitting in American captivity, eating green bean casserole and planting gardens, learning to cook with cream and butter, while their countrymen had been starving prisoners deliberately, methodically, as a matter of policy. The contrast was unbearable. The Americans had shown them mercy they had never expected, had fed them when they were malnourished, had treated them with a humanity that made the revelations about their own government even more damning. Heidi finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We were eating vegetables, real vegetables, while they—" She could not finish the sentence. The green beans in front of her, thriving in rich soil with adequate water and careful tending, seemed to mock everything she had believed about her service, about her country, about herself. That evening, none of the women could eat dinner. They sat in the mess hall, staring at plates of food that suddenly felt like accusations. Sergeant Kowalski did not force them, did not lecture. She simply had the kitchen staff wrap the food and save it for later, understanding that some truths required an empty stomach to digest. The garden continued growing outside, indifferent to human horror, while inside the barracks, 43 women lay awake, confronting the possibility that they had been proud servants of evil. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across America, while in the Pennsylvania prison camp, the German women harvested their first crop of radishes. The timing felt cruelly symbolic, their small victory of growth coinciding with their homeland's absolute defeat. The radishes were perfect, crisp, and peppery, exactly as radishes should be. Crystal held them in her dirt-stained hands and wept. Captain Morrison had received orders from Washington regarding repatriation procedures. Within weeks, transportation would be arranged to send the German prisoners back to Europe, to displaced persons camps, and eventually to whatever remained of their homes. He called an assembly in the mess hall, the same room where they had first tasted green bean casserole 6 months earlier. The women gathered quietly, their faces reflecting months of internal transformation. They were no longer the skeletal, desperate prisoners who had arrived in November. Their bodies had healed, filled out with proper nutrition, but their souls carried different wounds now, deeper ones, inflicted by knowledge rather than deprivation. Captain Morrison stood before them, official documents in hand. "Ladies," he began, and Corporal Chen translated. "Arrangements are being made for your return to Germany. You will be processed through facilities in Europe and released to return to your families." The silence that followed was profound. Then Heidi stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their shaking. She had been practicing this speech in English for days, working with Chen to get the words right. "Captain Morrison," she said carefully, "some of us wish to speak about this return." Around her, Tilda rose, then Hetty, then Crystal, then Edith, then 9 other women. 14 in total, standing while the others remained seated, their decision literally dividing the group. "We have been talking," Heidi continued, her accented English clear in the quiet room, "about what we return to. Germany is destroyed. Our families, we do not know if they live. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed." Tilda spoke next, her voice steadier than Heidi's. "Here, we learned what food means, not just eating, but sharing. Not just surviving, but living. The Americans taught us this, even though we were enemies." Captain Morrison listened with growing astonishment. In all his military service, he had never encountered prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. That evening, Sergeant Kowalski prepared a special dinner, green bean casserole, the same dish that had introduced them to American abundance. The women who had chosen to stay sat together at one table, those who had chosen to return at another, but there was no hostility between them, only understanding. Both groups faced uncertain futures, just different forms of uncertainty. The casserole tasted the same as it had at Thanksgiving, rich, creamy, comforting. But its meaning had changed. For some, it represented what they would carry back to Germany, a memory of mercy to sustain them through rebuilding. For others, it represented what they hoped to claim permanently, a life where abundance was shared rather than hoarded, where former enemies could sit together and eat. June 20th, 1945. The morning of departure arrived with clear skies and unexpected warmth. The 29 women who had chosen repatriation stood in formation outside the barracks, their few possessions packed in small canvas bags provided by the American military. They wore clean clothes, their bodies healthy in ways they had not been for years, their faces reflecting complex emotions that had no simple names. Sergeant Kowalski emerged from the kitchen carrying something wrapped in brown paper. She approached the group and began distributing packages to each woman. Inside were carefully folded recipe cards written in both English and German, containing instructions for green bean casserole, mashed potatoes, apple pie, and a dozen other American dishes they had learned to prepare. But more precious than the recipes were the small envelopes of seeds. "From our garden," Crystal explained, having helped Sergeant Kowalski prepare them. "Green beans, tomatoes, carrots, for when you have soil to plant them in." Edith accepted her package with trembling hands. She had been among the most resistant to the revelations about Germany's atrocities, had clung longest to her belief in the righteousness of their cause. But the garden had changed her. She had planted seeds, tended them, watched them grow into food that sustained life rather than destroying it. She would return to Germany, but she would return different than she had left. The women who were staying, Heidi, Tilda, Hetty, Crystal, and 10 others, stood in a separate group, watching their friends prepare to leave. The American government had agreed to reclassify them as displaced persons, beginning the lengthy process toward potential immigration status. Local families had already offered sponsorships. The Henderson family would take Heidi. Dr. Hayes had arranged for Tilda to continue nursing training. Each woman had found someone willing to vouch for them, to help them build new lives. The transport trucks arrived at 0900 hours. As the women began boarding, something unexpected happened. They began to sing. Not a German military song or a patriotic anthem, but Silent Night in English, the same carol they had attempted at Christmas. Their pronunciation was better now, their voices stronger, and the American soldiers listening found themselves removing their caps in respect. Private Morrison, who had shown kindness to these women from the beginning, approached the lead truck and handed up a final package. "For all of you," he said, "to share on the journey." Inside were sandwiches made with real bread, real meat, real vegetables, simple American food for the long trip to the coast, to the ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. The women accepted them with gratitude, understanding what the gesture meant. They were no longer enemies. They were no longer just prisoners being repatriated. They were people who had shared meals and gardens and small moments of grace with other people who had chosen mercy over hatred. As the trucks pulled away, Heidi stood with her hand raised in farewell, tears streaming down her face. The garden behind the mess hall was in full production now, green beans climbing their poles, tomatoes ripening in the sun. Some of those plants would feed the women who remained. Others would produce seeds for those who had left. 25 years later, November 1970. Heidi Keller Henderson stood in her kitchen in suburban Philadelphia, teaching her teenage granddaughter Sarah how to make green bean casserole. The recipe card was worn now, stained with decades of use, the handwriting faded but still legible. Sarah watched her grandmother's practiced hands blanch the green beans with the same care she had learned from Sergeant Kowalski a quarter-century earlier. "Why is this so important to you, Grandma?" Sarah asked, teenager impatience softening into genuine curiosity as she noticed tears gathering in her grandmother's eyes. Heidi paused, holding a green bean between her fingers. How could she explain to this American girl born into abundance what it meant to have been starving and then fed? How could she convey the transformation that happened when enemies chose mercy over vengeance? "This dish saved my life," Heidi said simply. "Not just my body, but my soul." Across the Atlantic, in a small town in Bavaria, Edith Richter was preparing the same recipe for a gathering of the German-American Friendship Society. The seeds she had carried home in 1945 had produced gardens that fed her family through the hardest years of Reconstruction. She had shared those seeds with neighbors, along with the recipes and the story of American kindness she had experienced as a prisoner. The green beans she used now came from descendants of those original seeds, a living connection to that Pennsylvania garden where she had learned that growth was possible even in the aftermath of horror. Tilda had become Dr. Matilda Bauer, head of nursing at Philadelphia General Hospital. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to healing as a form of ongoing repentance. She taught her nursing students not just medical procedures, but the philosophy she had learned in that prison camp kitchen, that care and nourishment were inseparable, that feeding someone properly was an act of radical dignity. Crystal had returned to farming, purchasing a small plot in Vermont where she grew vegetables using techniques that combined her Bavarian heritage with American abundance. Her farm stand sold produce to refugee families at reduced prices, and she always included recipe cards with her vegetables, passing forward the gift that had been given to her. The green bean casserole had become more than food. It had become a symbol carried across oceans and decades, a reminder that transformation was possible, that enemies could become friends, that the simple act of sharing a meal could change the course of lives. At Thanksgiving dinners in 1970, the dish appeared on tables throughout America and Germany, prepared by women who remembered and women who were learning the story for the first time. Each crispy onion topping, each creamy spoonful, each tender green bean carried forward a legacy of mercy that had begun in a prison camp where hungry women discovered that vegetables could indeed be rich, not just with cream and butter, but with the possibility of redemption, forgiveness, and hope.